Before I ask you the first question, I want to say what an honor it is for me to be doing this.
Oh boy.
It's a pleasure to be with you
Thank
this
you.
afternoon.
It's all mine.
Few people start with the intention of becoming an epidemiologist. So I wonder if you could describe your own path that brought you to epidemiology.
Okay. When I went to medical school, I was not really interested in curing patients one by one. I went there because I was curious about diseases and about the body and physiology and all that. So I have always had that interest that is beyond just the case. Okay, so then I am a pathologist, of course, and I had a straight internship in pathology. And at that time, this is a state in Colombia called Antioquia, which in that time, there was only one laboratory of pathology for the whole state. So every cancer that was diagnosed, more or less well diagnosed, basically with histology, was there. So I became interested in looking at the numbers in that statistics, and just continue that, and then when we graduate as medical doctors, we have to write a thesis, which is supposed to be an original piece of work. So I decided to do a study of the statistics of cancer in Antioquia, and so that's when it was very interesting. We discovered many things that we knew, but we were not sure that was there. The frequency of different cancers and the rarity of others. So I continued through that path. Then I went to Emory for pathology training, and there was a meeting in Washington on geographic pathology, which I attended and presented this paper in Antioquia. So they published this, and so it took it from there. So then when I came back to Colombia, I was working in Cali, and again we were doing all the pathology diagnosis for the city in my laboratory. So again, I put everything together and tried to study that, and then I wanted to present that in a pathology meeting which took place in Antioquia, in Medellin, in 1961. There was the meeting of the Latin American Society of Pathology. At that point, the organizers invited Dr. Harold Stewart, who was the chief of pathology at the Cancer Institute in Washington. And he came down, and I presented my papers, and then he got interested. And then he took the handout to Washington and showed it to Bill Hensel, who was the chief of biometry of the National Cancer Institute. Then he came down to New Orleans to visit me, and we decided to start the cancer registry in New Orleans, in Cali, Colombia. And so I learned many things that I didn't know, that we have to be limited to a geographic area. We only can count the residents, and we can only count new cases, et cetera, et cetera. So it just took me by the hand, and we started this cancer registry, which is still there. It's the only one in Latin America that has been there for 45 years now. And it was wonderful. So many things came out of that registry, and it was interesting. And Bill Hensel helped me to find ways to finance. So we didn't have money, so he got two things. One was a grant of $3,000 from the Fuller Fund, which is a company that sells brooms and things like that. So they have this, and with that we started. And then he got, there was at that point something called PL 480, which was a law of the Congress of the United States that agricultural surplus money from different countries could be used for scientific things in that country. So he applied for that surplus of money from Colombia, and we got the grant that kept us going. So then I became sort of entered through epidemiology through the side door.
with the Fuller Brush Company. That's a remarkable start. What would you say is the biggest difference between epidemiology as it was practiced when you first started out in your career and epidemiology today?
Well, I was in Colombia when we started this study, so it was my early sort of entrance into epidemiology was in Colombia. What was there and is still there is a big challenges. I mean, there are huge differences in cancer rates. I'm interested in cancer all the time, and in different populations, and also it's very efficient to work with the communities there because they're very cooperative, and most of them are very stable. So that was then. The problems were there was no money, there was not a well-developed research culture in Colombia, and but so you have the opportunities and the challenges, and that was okay. I don't know the situation in the United States at that time was different. The only thing I knew was through Bill Hensel. Now there are big differences. Of course, it has grown very much, the discipline, although it's become more diffuse, the targets. It's less focused to solving specific problems. In etiology, it's more descriptive and more analytical, but I think it's a little bit more diffuse. So,
you started out in Colombia and you ended up here in the United States and have been here for many years, but what person would you single out as having most strongly influenced your career?
well, I will have to start with my pathology professor, which is Professor Pelayo Correa now. He was the chief of pathology there. He was a very modest and humble man, but very much strict. He taught me to be honest, and sometimes in pathology it was not very popular to have some point of view, some diagnosis that was not shared by clinicians and other people. And he taught me to be intensive and go deep into it. But then my most influential person is Bill Hensel. I consider him like my intellectual father. I was so lucky to find him in my life. He came to Cali and to Colombia, and he helped me in any aspects. As I told you about the funding, about the administration of the thing, about study and sort of finding out the opportunities, especially by looking at the cancer registry data. And so he guided me from point A to point Z. It is very, very helpful to me.
The next question I'd like to ask you is about collaboration. Collaboration is essential to successful epidemiologic studies. What have you found to be the most important ingredients in a good collaboration, and with whom have you had some of your best collaborations?
Okay, I think a branch of epidemiology is etiology, and I consider myself an etiologist because that's what my interest lie in, trying to find out what causes, especially cancer, because I have been sort of dedicated to study cancer. So etiology is a multidisciplinary science or enterprise. So I consider myself a part of a team. And the other members of this team have to be clinicians and have to be laboratory scientists. And of course, you need some statistician to back you up and keep you honest. And, so I think collaboration is for etiology is part of it. It's just integral part of it. Yeah. And so I have always collaborated with 100% card-carrying epidemiologists like you, and statisticians, and laboratory people. And in my group, there is always a statistician and epidemiologist. In the laboratory, mostly pathology, but also microbiology and genetics and others.
Great, thank you. Whom would you regard as the 2 or 3 most important epidemiologists during your lifetime, and what's your basis for those choices?
Well, the most important in my lifetime has been Richard Doll, no question about that. He is sort of an example for the world. He's just not member of UK, he's a universal person. And one of the major contributions that he did was the linking tobacco to cancer, which in those days many people didn't believe. But his studies were so deep and so objective and so sort of convincing that he convinced everybody that this was the truth. And also he has influenced epidemiologists all over the world. So no question about that. In my personal experience, Bill Hensel has to come out, because he is very modest. He was not much fanfare about it, but he was very objective and truthful and dedicated. And so it was. He has done many things, like the migrant studies, for instance. That was sort of the first approach to trying to separate genetic influence from environmental influences. And his studies on stomach cancer in Japanese are classical, So everybody knew that after you migrate from Japan and your children are of Japanese blood, but they don't develop high rates of cancer. So genetics was not the cause of that. So I think and that sort of started this what we call now gene-environment interactions, which are very, very important. Of course, there were 2 sort of stars of epidemiology in this country, which I knew about, is Abraham Lilienfeld and Brian McMahon, which are the teachers. But also, I will have to say that another person that has very much influenced this field is Joe Fraumini from National Cancer Institute. He was and is so respected in the NIH in general that has influenced the policies of the NIH. He, of course, has a very strong intramural program, which is a little bit in competition with the extramural, but he has been a very important influence.
Thank you. In turning from other epidemiologists back to yourself, I wonder if you could share what you think your most influential paper was, and which paper do you think was the most underappreciated?
Well, I'll have to say that the most influential paper is the Lancet 75 paper, when we described the precancerous process for stomach. And I think that's important because in those days, epidemiologists only look at cancer and controls. And it's like cancer appeared magically. And many epidemiologists, card-carrying serial told me, well, you put me to think that this thing starts before we diagnose the cancer. So I think that's been influential. And of course, the passive smoking work that we worked together on has been very important. I think that convinced the EPA and the world that this was truth. Again, like in the case of Richard Doll, nobody believed that the person smoking close to you will harm you, but now this is it is so clear. So I would have to say the most underestimated and sort of frustrating experience for me has been this. When we were in Cali, Colombia, cervix cancer was the most important cancer, and it was huge. So we started a program of cytology. and we convinced different parts of the government and some private enterprises to set up a lab, a central lab, because I knew that the quality control for the lab is crucial. And the American Cancer Society gave us a few money to buy a microscope and some other implement things for the cancer. So we did start a very widespread screening program in the city of Cali. And in a few years, we saw how the rate of invasive cancer was going down and how the rate of in situ cancer was going up. And this was parallel with the development of the cytology screening program. So it was obvious that that was the cause. What happens after that, the bureaucrats got into that. They split the central lab, and there is some cytology screening, but in Latin America and in general in the developing world, it has not been doing the job that is expected to do. And just because you develop the science, but the other forces in the humanity take care of the thing and break it.
I think you've actually touched on this a bit in one of your earlier questions, but how have you chosen the research questions that you want to ask and address?
It's all about curiosity again, but I am very interested in the burden of disease for the population, and I have always been interested in trying to say why, you know? And so, for instance, when I was in Colombia many years ago, I started to study endemic goiter, which are very common there. And we wrote papers and described the thing, and then there came the program by the government to put iodine in the salt, and the thing just disappeared. So, just as an example. So, I find some problem that is really relevant, and I ask why, and then that's where I take it from there. So, for instance, right now, working in stomach cancer and Helicobacter pylori, I have, in collaboration with this program project that we are in it together, that there are big differences in the rate of cancer and precancer lesions in the same general area in the south of Colombia. But the people who live in the mountains have very high prevalence of infection and very high rates of cancer. The people who live in the coast, they have very high prevalence of infection, but no high rate of cancer. So that's my present challenge. Why is that happening?
And I wish you every success in finding out. Which of your contributions to the field would you most like to be remembered for?
Well, I'll have to say it's the 75 Lancet paper, because it's what we call the cascade paper. We describe the cascade of premalignant lesions. And so this has been really adopted by many scientists and pathologists, and although there are people who challenge the thing, but it's still there. And so I guess that's the most influential thing that I have to count on.
What about your major interest outside of your epidemiology activities?
I am so, what the word, workaholic, that I don't have a lot of interest outside my work. Of course, my main interest is my family. That's what I enjoy more. I'm considered very lucky with my wife and my kids and my grandchildren, which are a joy. So I spend a lot of time on that, and I enjoy every minute of that. Unfortunately, Katrina brought some disruption to that, because some of the family had to be split, and so we can't do it. But that's my thing. I am also interested, as I say, in the burden of problems in the populations, and so I link that a little bit to the politicians and to the administrators and the people who are the leaders of society. So I am interested sort of study the etiology of these problems and linking them and reading books about different actors and different contemporary leaders of the world, and sort of interested in figuring out some of the things that are important, like the sort of narrow thinking of some people, and that not so cause-effect related, but just pragmatic, and the societies just suffer the consequences. So I'm interested in that process.
So the political and policy
Yeah.
implications that lead to burdens on populations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In your opinion, and this is a very broad question, what has been epidemiology's most important contribution to society?
They have been great, not very well appreciated. I think that most of the causation of disease has been reached through an epidemiology path. Sometimes the people who do the link between cause and effect don't call themselves epidemiologists, but that's what they are. And they are studying the phenomena that are happening in the society. So the epidemiologists, although, you know, PhDs and Doctor of Public Health in epidemiology are not so many, but they have influenced everybody else. So you have molecular biologists, and you have chemists, and you have pharmacologists, and occupational scientists just doing epidemiology. And so even not so clear, they have permeated their discipline to the rest of the scientific community.
What is your assessment of the current state of the health of epidemiology? What do you think the biggest risks to our profession are, and what are the richest opportunities?
It's a mixed bag, because I see some very important contributions of epidemiology, but I worry a little bit about the health of the epidemiology, because it's become less focused, it's become more diffuse. You have excellent departments of epidemiology in many universities, but I sort of see that there are two tendencies. Some centers are developing such a technical epidemiology that is almost philosophical and statistical and mathematical. So people get fascinated with the philosophy and the statistics and the mathematics, and they forget that epidemiology is utilitarian science, where they could be much more applied. There's another group that's kind of curious to me. It's like a social epidemiology. They are developing centered about disparities in health in the different communities, and they are looking at it from a sociological angle, which is okay. Sometimes sort of bordering on the political implications, so that's very interesting, to be spectacular, but not so clear how much are you doing to change these societies. That's sort of out of the reach of the epidemiologists, but they spend hours in meetings doing that kind of exercise.
What do you see as the richest opportunities that we have now that we didn't have some years ago?
Yeah, okay. Epidemiology has been very intricately related to molecular biology lately, and they have been very fruitful. For instance, when some years ago, all the drugs to treat cancer were poisons. Now we're looking at the molecular mechanisms and trying to make interventions based on the discovery in epidemiology. So that's going very well. There is a danger there that the epidemiology may become so molecular that they forget about the cause and effect relationship and all that. So another opportunity that I think is underutilized is the international studies. There are many examples of very peculiar situations in countries that are not the United States or Western Europe that you could exploit. Unfortunately, it's very hard to be funded for that, and so, but there lies an opportunity that's sort of underutilized.
Do you have any predictions about what the future might hold for our field?
Well, as I was saying, it's sort of going in different directions. I hope that it will continue to influence all the other scientists, those basic and clinical arts, but as I see these two dichotomies, the mathematical, philosophical, and the social, political branches, and they're sort of becoming too separated, and I cannot know or guess what's going to happen in 30 or 40, 50 years from now.
Fair enough. What would be the single most important piece of advice you could give to a new epidemiologist just starting his or her career?
Well, I have had opportunity to deal with some of this, and I think the advice that I will give is stick to your instincts and your guesses and your sort of things that you think interest you, because that's what interests you. And the success in any discipline is that you are interested in what you are doing. Even if you are wrong, the first hypothesis, don't abandon it. Just go ahead and you have to study it solidly with good basis. But I would say not to consult senior epidemiologists too soon, because then you lose your spark, you lose your thrust. You have to consult later, because then you can be totally wet, and then there has to be changed. But I think that's the advice that I will give to a young person.
Sage advice, I would say. Thank you very much. That's
okay.
the last of my questions.
Okay, good. Thank you for interviewing me and all of this.